The wind comes down from the Beaverhead Mountains without asking permission. It moves through the grass in long, slow waves, bends the sage almost to the earth, and then passes through the empty streets of Bannack as though it has somewhere else to be. There is no one to hear it rattle the loose boards of the hotel, no one to feel it press against the warped wood of the old church doors. The town simply receives it, as it has received everything for more than a century and a half, without complaint, without resistance, with a kind of patient stillness that feels less like abandonment and more like waiting. Bannack sits in a fold of southwestern Montana in Grasshopper Creek Valley, sheltered on its southern side by ridges that turn gold in late summer and blue-grey in the cold months. The mountains beyond are older than anything that happened here. They were ancient before the first wagon rolled through the sage, before the first pan dipped into the cold water of the creek, before the first man shouted in the particular way a man shouts when the world has just changed for him. The mountains have watched all of it, and they have said nothing, and they are watching still. To stand in Bannack today is to experience a peculiar kind of silence. It is not the silence of a place where nothing has happened. It is the opposite, the silence of a place where so much happened, so quickly, and with such ferocity of human ambition that the very air seems to have been worn thin by it. The buildings stand in various states of surrender. Some lean slightly, as though tired. Others remain remarkably upright, and their squared log constructions still sound after 160 years of Montana weather. Paint has long since given way to silver-grey wood. Glass has clouded where it has not shattered. Doors hang at angles that suggest the slow, geological patience of decay, not ruin exactly, but the honest process of a structure returning, inch by inch, decade by decade, to the earth from which it came. The main street is unpaved, as it always was. The ruts worn into it by wagon wheels and boot heels have softened over the generations, filled by wind-carried silt and the patient work of grasses pushing up from below. But the shape of the street remains, the width of it, the curve of it, as it follows the creek, the way the buildings line up on either side, with the particular informality of a frontier town, placed not by plan, but by need, and by argument, by whoever got there first with the lumber and the nerve. Walking it slowly, the proportions of the old world begin to reassert themselves. The distances between doorways feel right for a town that moved on foot and on horseback. The sightlines feel right, open to the mountains at both ends, hemmed by dark timber on the ridges above. The creek runs below the town, clear and cold and indifferent, as it always has. Grasshopper Creek. The name is prosaic, almost comic, for a waterway that changed the history of a territory. It does not look like the kind of place where history is made. It looks like what it is. A modest mountain creek running over smooth stones, cutting through a narrow valley, doing what water does without any particular interest in human affairs. And yet in July of 1862, this creek gave up something that would bring thousands of men and women to this remote and difficult country within months, something that would establish a capital city, generate a vigilante war, and leave behind a ghost town so well preserved that visitors to it sometimes feel, in certain moments and in certain lights, that the town is not entirely empty. The man who first found gold here was named John White. He was among a party of prospectors who had been working their way through the mountains of what was then the western edge of Dakota Territory, moving from one creek to another in the methodical, hopeful, often disappointed rhythm of men who believed that the next drainage, the next gravel bar, the next pan of cold water might finally contain what they had been looking for, most of the time it did not. The mountains of the west were full of men who had been almost right, who had panned a creek a mile upstream from a major strike, who had moved on a week before someone else found colour in a place they had already abandoned. The history of gold mining is as much a history of bad timing and bad luck as it is of discovery. But John White's timing, on that summer day in 1862, was right. The exact details of the moment have been smoothed by retelling until what remains is more legend than a record. The image of a man kneeling by the water, the glint of something in the pan, the held breath, the second look. What is documented is the result. The gold was there, and it was substantial, and the word travelled. In the days and weeks that followed, Grasshopper Creek became a place with a name, and then a place with people, and then, with a speed that would seem impossible if it were not so thoroughly documented, a town. The men who came first came fast and came light. They carried what they could on their backs, or on the backs of mules. They came from the depleted diggings of Colorado, from California, from the gold camps of Idaho and Nevada. They came from the east, from farms in Ohio and Missouri and Virginia, from cities they had already left behind, once in pursuit of something better. They came from Ireland and from Cornwall and from China. They came speaking different languages, holding different memories of different failures, united only by the specific gravity of gold and the particular hunger that the promise of it creates in men who have been poor or who fear becoming poor again. The valley filled with tents first, then with rough shelters of canvas and pine poles, then with the first permanent structures, log cabins built with green timber, their walls still fragrant with pitch, their roofs made of whatever came to hand. By the fall of 1862, there were several hundred people in Grasshopper Creek Valley. By the spring of 1863, there were several thousand. The town that emerged from this rapid accumulation of human need and human ambition was called Bannack, a name derived from the Bannack people, the indigenous inhabitants of this region, who had lived in and travelled through this valley long before any prospector bent over the creek. The spelling drifted from the beginning, appearing in different documents as Bannack, 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 as though even the name of the place was still working out what it wanted to be. What emerged in those first furious months was both more and less than a town in the conventional sense. There were saloons before there were churches. There were dance halls before there were schools. There was commerce of every conceivable kind being conducted in structures that would not have been considered habitable in the cities these people had come from. Rough counters laid across barrels, goods stacked on earthen floors, transactions made in gold dust weighed on small scales. The weight and purity of the dust itself a matter of constant negotiation and occasional dispute. The hotel that still stands on the main street of Bannack today, the Mead Hotel, as it would eventually be called, was in those early years a different kind of gathering place, a courthouse, a meeting hall, a centre of whatever civic function the town was attempting to establish amid the general chaos of its own becoming. To imagine Bannack in the winter of 1862 requires a deliberate act of historical imagination, an effort to fill the silent streets with what they once contained. The cold in this valley is serious cold, the kind that freezes the creek solid by December, that turns the mud of the main street to iron overnight, that finds every gap in every wall and makes itself at home inside. Men huddled in their cabins around fires that burned green wood and smoked badly. They ate what they had brought with them, or what the overworked and undersupplied merchants of the town could provide at prices that reflected the difficulty of getting anything to this place, which was far from every road that mattered. Flour was expensive. Fresh meat was intermittent. Scurvy was a real concern, as it always was in mining camps where men subsisted on limited and unvarying diets through the long months when nothing grew. And yet they stayed. The gold was enough, the daily take from the creek and from the sluice boxes and from the developing hard rock operations in the hillsides above the town was enough to keep men working through conditions that would have sent them home under almost any other circumstances. This is one of the persistent mysteries of the gold camps. The degree to which the proximity of mineral wealth altered men's calculations, their tolerances, their definitions of an acceptable life. Men who would never have spent a winter in such a place, who had families and farms and comfortable habits elsewhere, found themselves frozen into a Montana valley and the chipping ice from their water buckets in the morning, and considering themselves fortunate. The buildings that remain in Bannack today were not built by wealthy men. They were built by people working with whatever material was immediately available, with skills acquired on the frontier rather than in the trade, with a pragmatism born of necessity. The log construction used throughout the town is not ornamental. It is functional, direct, honest about what it is and what it is for. The notching at the corners is neat enough to suggest competence without suggesting anything beyond it. The interiors would have been dim and smoky, heated by iron stoves fed with wood cut from the ridges above town. Walls were sometimes lined with canvas to reduce drafts, or papered with whatever newspapers or printed material had survived the long journey to this place. The floors were often bare earth at first, then rough-cut boards that would warp and gap as they dried. The church still stands at the far end of the main street, its simple form unchanged from when it was built in 1877, making it one of the later buildings in the town's history. But it looks older than its age, worn by the same weather that has worn everything here, its white paint long gone, its wood grey and checked with age. To stand inside it is to stand in a space that has the quality, common to old religious buildings everywhere, of concentrated human feeling, the accumulated weight of all the Sundays, all the prayers, all the occasions, all the grief and hope that a frontier community would have brought into such a space over the decades. The light comes through the windows in the particular way of old glass, slightly irregular, slightly amber, as though filtered through time itself. It was into this world of improvised order and genuine deprivation that Henry Plummer arrived. And Plummer's story is perhaps the most disturbing and the most revealing of all the stories that Bannack contains. He arrived in the winter of 1862, having come from California by way of Idaho, carrying with him a reputation that was already complicated. He was 30 years old, handsome in the particular way that frontier accounts describe, well dressed by the standards of the place, pleasant in manner, articulate, seemingly reasonable. He was also, by the time he arrived in Bannack, a man with blood on his hands in multiple jurisdictions, a man who had been imprisoned and pardoned and had gone on to kill again, a man whose charm and apparent respectability served as cover for a character that operated entirely outside the moral framework he appeared to share with the communities he entered. The people of Bannack elected him sheriff. They did this in the spring of 1863, and it is important to resist the temptation to treat this as a simple act of collective foolishness. The election of Henry Plummer reflected the genuine difficulty of establishing order in a place that had grown too fast for any of the normal mechanisms of civil life to keep pace. There was no established law enforcement tradition here, no institutional memory, and no network of people who knew one another well enough to vouch reliably for one another's characters. Plummer presented himself as competent and willing at a moment when both qualities were scarce. He was persuasive. He was familiar with the language and the appearance of legitimate authority. And he was, by all accounts, very good at concealing who he actually was. What Plummer was actually doing while serving as sheriff was organizing and directing a gang of road agents, men who preyed systematically on the gold shipments and the individuals moving through the mountain passes between Bannack and the other growing communities of the territory. The gang operated under a structure that had the grim efficiency of a criminal enterprise that had thought carefully about its own survival. Recognition signals, code words, a hierarchy of leadership, a system for identifying which travelers were worth robbing and which should be left alone to reduce the risk of escalating attention. The road agents killed. The exact number of their victims is disputed by historians, but the generally accepted accounting runs to more than 100, perhaps considerably more, over the period of roughly 2 years in which they operated. The violence of this period is not easy to hold in mind while standing in the quiet streets of Bannack today. The silence is too complete, the light too clear, the mountains too serene. But the violence was real, and it was close. It happened on the roads between here and there, on cold nights and in remote canyons, to men who had worked hard for what they carried, and who trusted that the sheriff they had elected would protect them. The betrayal at the centre of the Plummer story, the betrayal not just of individuals, but of the entire social compact of a community trying to establish itself, has the quality of a true moral catastrophe, the kind that leaves a mark not only on the historical record, but on the atmosphere of a place. The response to that catastrophe was itself morally complicated. The Montana Vigilantes, the group of men who formed in the winter of 1863 and early 1864 to address the failure of official law enforcement, operated outside the law they claimed to be defending. They organized in secret, identified their targets through interrogation of captured gang members, and proceeded to execute 22 men within a period of weeks. Henry Plummer was hanged in Bannack on January 10, 1864, from the gallows that he himself had ordered, built during his tenure as sheriff. The dark irony of this fact has been noted in every account of Bannack's history, and it still carries weight because it contains something true about the nature of human institutions, the way they can be turned against their own purposes by the very people entrusted with maintaining them. The gallows site is still marked in Bannack today. It sits at the edge of the town site, modest and unremarkable in its physical dimensions, but charged with the knowledge of what happened there. To stand near it is to be reminded that the questions the vigilantes raised about justice and procedure, about when extra-legal action is justified and who gets to decide, are not historical questions. They are permanent questions, or ones that every society organized around law must continually reckon with, and ones that become particularly urgent when official institutions fail the people they are meant to serve. While all of this was unfolding, Bannack was acquiring a status that would have seemed improbable even to the most optimistic of its early settlers. In May of 1864, the United States Congress established Montana Territory, carved from the eastern portion of Idaho Territory, in recognition of the extraordinary concentration of mining activity and population that had developed in this region. And Bannack, this collection of log buildings along a mountain creek, this improvised and violent and still very young town, was designated as Montana's first territorial capital. The designation brought new energy and new population to the already crowded valley. A government required officers, and the officers required buildings, and the buildings required lumber and labor and a particular kind of civic ambition that expresses itself in stone and timber. The Mead Hotel, which still anchors the main street of Bannack, was in this period serving as the site of governmental functions. Territorial courts were held here, official meetings conducted, the machinery of a nascent bureaucracy operating in rooms that smelled of pine pitch and tobacco, and the particular composite odour of a great many people living in close proximity to one another in a place that had not yet developed the infrastructure to manage such density. But the designation of Bannack as capital was already becoming a historical footnote almost as soon as it was made. The discovery of gold at Alder Gulch, some 80 miles to the east, in May of 1863, even before Montana Territory was formally established, had set in motion a shift that would render Bannack secondary almost immediately. Virginia City, the town that grew at Alder Gulch, was larger, richer, and better positioned. By 1865, the territorial capital had been moved to Virginia City, and Bannack found itself in the particular position of a place that had been briefly, brilliantly central, and then was not. The transition from capital to ordinary mining town happened too fast for the people who lived through it to fully absorb. Men who had arrived expecting to be part of something permanent found themselves in something that was already beginning to diminish. The gold in Grasshopper Creek was not inexhaustible. No place of gold ever is. The easily accessible deposits, the gold that could be recovered with a pan and a wooden sluice box, and the brute labour of men working waist-deep in cold water, were worked out relatively quickly. What remained required more sophisticated and more expensive methods to extract. Hydraulic mining, dredging, hard rock operations that required capital and machinery and organisation beyond what individual prospectors could provide. Some men left immediately, following the gold to Alder Gulch, to Last Chance Gulch, to the next place and the next, always moving toward whatever rumour promised another Grasshopper Creek. This was the rhythm of the mining frontier: constant motion, perpetual hopefulness, the willingness to abandon what had already been claimed in pursuit of what might still be found. The towns that grew in these places were understood by the people who built them to be temporary, though few were willing to admit this openly, because to admit the temporary nature of a place was to admit something uncomfortable about one's own situation and prospects. Others stayed in Bannack, for reasons that varied person to person. Some had made investments in property or in local businesses that were not easily liquidated. Some had families or had acquired them. The women who came to Bannack, as wives, as entrepreneurs, as school teachers and laundresses, and the operators of boarding houses, were often less mobile than the men, their circumstances more complexly rooted in the actual physical place. Some stayed simply because they had already left so many places and were tired of leaving, and tired of the accumulation of new beginnings, ready to commit to something even if that something was declining. The school that stands in Bannack, the building that housed the first formal education in Montana Territory, was built in 1863, and its existence tells something important about the aspirations of the people who built this town. Schools are not built by people who plan to leave. Schools are built by people who intend to stay, who are raising children and hoping those children will raise children in the same place. The women who organised the school, who hired the teachers, who made sure the building was constructed and maintained, were making an argument against the transience that defined so much of frontier life. They were insisting, quietly and practically, that this place was worth becoming permanent. The argument was not entirely lost. Bannack did not empty all at once. It diminished over decades, losing population in waves that corresponded to the cycles of mining activity, periods of renewed effort when new methods or new capital, or simply new optimism, brought men back to the creek, followed by periods of retreat when the economics did not support the work. The dredge that operated in Grasshopper Creek in the early 20th century, one of the large machines that could process enormous quantities of gravel and recover gold from deposits that would have been uneconomical by any earlier method, left behind the long parallel ridges of tailings that still run along the creek today, the raw material of the valley rearranged into orderly lines of discarded stone, a kind of geological handwriting left by an industrial process. To walk along those tailings now is to feel the scale of the enterprise, the ambition of it, the determination to extract value from this valley to the last practical possibility. The ridges of stone are surprisingly high in places, high enough to alter the local topography, to redirect the wind, to cast shadows in the late afternoon that fall across the old town site in a way the original settlers would not have recognized. They are part of Bannack now, as much as the log buildings and the creek and the mountains, part of the accumulated evidence of what human beings did in this particular fold of the earth over the course of a century. The last permanent residents of Bannack were a family named Valaton. They remained in the town into the 1970s, long after everyone else had gone, maintaining a life in a place that had become, and by any conventional measure, uninhabitable, not because the buildings had failed entirely, but because the infrastructure of daily life had been stripped away so completely. There were no services, no commerce, no community in any functioning sense. There was only the valley, the creek, the wind, the mountains, and the buildings in which the Valetons chose to continue living. What they found in that life, what sustained them in it, what the experience of being the last people in a ghost town actually felt like from the inside. These are questions that the historical record does not fully answer, and that is, perhaps, as it should be. Some things about the human relationship to place are not easily translated into documents. In 1954, the state of Montana acquired Bannack and established it as a state park. The decision to preserve the town rather than demolish it or allow it to continue its unmanaged decline was not inevitable. Many ghost towns of the American West were simply left to fall, their buildings collapsing over decades into barely distinguishable mounds of rotted timber and scattered stone. The preservation of Bannack represented a choice, a deliberate decision that the physical evidence of this particular place and this particular period of history had value beyond its material worth, that the buildings themselves, imperfect and incomplete, and already well into their long surrender to weather, contained something worth protecting. The philosophy that has guided the preservation of Bannack is one of stabilized decay rather than restoration. The buildings are maintained against collapse, reinforced where necessary to prevent the sudden failure of a wall or a roof, but they are not restored to any approximation of their original appearance. They are allowed to show their age, to carry the evidence of everything that has happened to them since they were built. This is a philosophically honest approach, one that acknowledges that the authentic experience of Bannack includes not only the history of the 1860s and 1870s, but the full arc of time since then. The decades of slow abandonment, the winters and the summers, the long patience of a place learning to exist without people. Walking the main street in the early morning, before the day has warmed and before any other visitors have arrived, it is possible to stand in a quality of experience that approaches the historical. The light at that hour is flat and clear, and the buildings cast long shadows across the unpaved street. The creek is audible below, the same sound it has always made, indifferent to all the years between. The mountains are the same mountains. The wind, when it comes, is the same wind. And standing in the middle of that street, in that light, it is possible to feel something that is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is too comfortable, too vaguely pleasant, but rather a more precise and more troubling awareness of the contingency of things, of how quickly a place can fill with human life and purpose and aspiration, and how quietly it can empty again. The hotel stands as it always has at the centre of this street, its proportions still imposing. Its 2 stories making it the tallest building in a town where most everything else was built low and close to the ground. The windows on the upper floor look out across the valley to the south, toward the mountains that turn different colours through the day, pale in the morning, deepened by afternoon sun, blue in the dusk. Whatever was visible from those windows when the hotel was new is still largely visible now. The mountains have not moved. The valley has not changed its shape. The creek has not altered its course significantly. What has changed is everything that was human. The crowds, the noise, the commerce, the violence, the hope. All of that has passed through this valley and out the other side, leaving the physical landscape almost as it was, with the addition of those long ridges of dredge tailings along the creek, and the silver-grey buildings along the street, and the quiet that covers everything now like a second sky. And the church at the far end of the street was built late in the town's life, when the population had already begun its long contraction. There is something moving in that timing, in the fact that a community diminishing by every measurable indicator still found the resources and the will to build a place of worship, still believed that the gesture was worth making. The congregation that gathered in that building on its first Sunday was smaller than the congregation that had met in whatever improvised space served that purpose in the early years. But they came. They sat in the wooden pews, which are still there, and looked toward the simple altar, which is still there, and brought their prayers and their doubts and their persistence to a building they had built in a town that was already, in some important sense, leaving. And the jail that stands in Bannack, the small log structure with its heavy door and its narrow interior, held some of the territory's most notorious men in the years when the town had claim to that status. It is not an impressive building, no jail of that period, and that place was impressive. It was built for function, not appearance, and its function was temporary custody in a system that had not yet developed the apparatus of long-term incarceration. What happened in Bannack in those years often bypassed the jail entirely, moving directly from accusation to execution in the compressed and extra-legal proceedings that the vigilante period made typical. The jail is a reminder of the aspiration toward due process that existed alongside the impulse toward a summary justice. Both were present, both were real, and the tension between them was never fully resolved. The assay office, where the gold that came out of the creek and the hillsides was weighed and valued and converted into the currency of the wider world, occupied a specific and important place in the economy of the town. Every ounce of gold that moved through Bannack passed through the assay process in one form or another, and the men who ran those operations held a power that was not always visible in the official hierarchy of the town, but was nonetheless fundamental. The gold dust that men carried in leather pouches, the nuggets that had been pried from quartz veins or retrieved from creek gravel by the patient work of panning, all of it eventually had to be converted into something that the larger economy could use, and the conversion happened here, in this valley, and in buildings that no longer serve that purpose but still stand. Bannack receives visitors now from every part of the country and beyond, people who come for different reasons. Some for the history, some for the photography, some for the ghost town atmosphere that American culture has always found compelling. There are those who come hoping to feel something of what is alleged to be supernatural, because Bannack has accumulated over the decades the reputation of a haunted place, and the reputation is not entirely inexplicable. A place that has seen as much as Bannack has seen, that has held as much concentrated human drama as this valley held in those first furious years, that has stood empty for as long as it has stood empty. Such a place would naturally attract the projection of lingering presences. Whether those presences are real in any literal sense is a question that falls outside the scope of what history can address. but the feeling that a place carries its past in some more than merely informational way, that the very materials of old buildings have absorbed something of the lives lived within them. This is a feeling that most people who spend time in Bannack report, regardless of their views on the supernatural. What is certainly true, and what requires no supernatural explanation, is that Bannack is a place of extraordinary historical density. Very little ground in Montana, or in the American West generally, contains as much significant history in as compact a physical space. The first gold discovery that would trigger the Montana Gold Rush. The first seat of Montana territorial government, and the home and jurisdiction of the most notorious outlaw lawman in the history of the frontier. The site of the organized vigilante movement that ended that man's operation and raised questions about justice and law that have not been settled in the century and a half since. All of this in a valley a few miles long, in a town that at its peak held perhaps 3,000 souls, and at its end held one family and their memories. The afternoon light moves across the front of the hotel in the way it has moved across every afternoon since the building was constructed. The shadows lengthen. The mountains to the south turn a deeper shade of gold. The wind that came down from the Beaverhead this morning has quieted, as it often quiets toward evening, leaving the valley in a stillness that feels almost deliberate, almost chosen. And the creek runs on below the town, as it has always run, indifferent and clear. The buildings stand in their patient angles of slight collapse, holding what they hold, yielding slowly to what they will eventually yield entirely to. There were men who died on these streets in anger and in desperation, and sometimes in the confused violence of men who did not quite understand what they were fighting for. There were women who raised children in these rooms and buried some of them in the cemetery on the hill above the town, where the markers still stand in various states of legibility, the names on some of them worn past, reading by the same weather that has worn everything else in this valley. There were children who walked the main street on summer mornings, who played along the creek bank, who attended school in the building that still stands, who grew up in a place that was already beginning to change into what it would become. Some of them left. Some stayed longer than they perhaps should have. Some are buried in the hill cemetery, having spent their entire lives in this valley. The cemetery asks its own kind of attention. It sits above the town on a slight rise, the graves marked by wooden markers and stone markers and iron markers in varying states of survival. Some of the names are readable, many are not. The dates that are legible tell their own stories, the clusters of deaths in certain years, the ages at which people died, the frequency of infant and child burials that speaks to the brutal arithmetic of mortality in a place without adequate medical care, without sanitation infrastructure, without the accumulated defences against disease that more established communities had developed. To read the cemetery of a frontier town is to read an argument against romanticism, against the temptation to see the gold rush years as a kind of adventure, a grand and colourful chapter in an American story of expansion and enterprise. The people in that cemetery on the hill did not experience it as a story. They experienced it as their lives, with all the difficulty and loss and ordinary suffering that lives contain. And yet, there was also, genuinely, something extraordinary about what happened in this valley. Not in the sense that the mythology of the West would have it, not the heroic narrative of civilization conquering wilderness, not the simple story of industry rewarded and ambition justified, but extraordinary in the more basic sense that several thousand human beings, drawn from wildly different places and circumstances and backgrounds, attempted in this remote and difficult valley to build something, a community, a government, a set of shared institutions, under conditions that made every aspect of that attempt enormously difficult. They largely failed. The community did not persist. The government moved on. The institutions dissolved or relocated. But the attempt itself was real, and the physical evidence of it is still here, in the log walls and the unpaved streets, and the silent church and the gallows site and the creek running on through all of it. The light is going now. The mountains to the south have lost their gold and gone to a dark blue that will deepen into black. When the first stars are appearing above the eastern ridge, the hotel is dark in all its windows. The church at the far end of the street is a shape against the sky, its simple silhouette unchanged from the silhouette it has always had. The wind has come back, quieter now, moving through the sage outside the town, and then through the town itself, through the gaps in the old boards, through the empty rooms and the empty doorways, making the sounds that wind makes in empty places. Not words, not messages, not the voices of the dead, but simply the sound of air moving through the evidence of human endeavour, patient and indifferent and continuous. Bannack will stand here tomorrow, and in the winter that comes after this summer, and in the summers that follow the winters, for as long as the state maintains it, and the logs hold and the roofs keep enough of the weather out to prevent the sudden failure of the walls. It will go on receiving the wind and the light and the visitors who come to stand in its streets and try to feel what it contains. The creek will run. The mountains will hold their positions. The cemetery on the hill will continue its slow dialogue with the weather, its markers becoming less and less legible as the years accumulate, the names retreating into the wood and stone from which they were carved, the people they named becoming first anonymous and then simply part of the general silence. That is what Bannack, finally, most truly is. A silence made of everything that was said and done and hoped and lost in this valley, held in the particular stillness of a place that has outlasted all its reasons for existing and persists anyway, the way certain things persist, not because the world requires them to, but because they have not yet fully finished with being here.